Now, I would have paid anything to have been a fly on the wall last night at dinner at Mar-a-Lago, where Donald Trump was there with the British ambassador and with our foreign secretary, Lord Cameron. Let's have a look at what Cameron had to say about President Trump just a few years ago.
I think his remarks are divisive, stupid and wrong, and I think if he came to visit our country, I think it'd unite us all against him.
Cameron, of course, Cameron, ever the globalist, and Cameron, of course, a great friend of President Obama. His former conservative politics, very close to President Obama's, who, of course, if you remember, intervened in our referendum and told us, vote Brexit, you'll go to the back of the queue. I'd love to have been there last night to see Cameron eating humble pie. Well, I'm joined down the line by K.T McFarland, President Trump's, of course, first Deputy National Security Advisor, and also somebody who held security posts in the Nixon, Ford and Reagan administrations. Who better than I hate to call you a veteran, but I'm going to have to call you a Republican veteran and an observer of these things. Isn't it funny? All these people, Katie, around the world who've been rude, vile about Donald Trump, in the end, they all have to come and break bread, don't they?
Well, not only break bread, but they've got to listen to what he's saying. And when Donald Trump's talking about where he's talking about the Middle East, whether he's talking about China or the Ukraine war, they've got to take him seriously. And the great thing about Donald Trump, which you understand more than anyone, having been in the business world before the political world, is Donald Trump looks at all of these situations and doesn't say, let's send in the Marines or let's, talk about them at the UN. He says, let's use the economic weapon, whether it's an economic weapon against Iran or the economic weapon against Russia and Ukraine or the economic weapon against China. So not only was David Cameron eating humble pie after what he said and the insults he gave to President Trump, but he probably got an earful on a very different kind of policies than the ones he always had promoted in office and continues to promote.
Yeah, I mean, they say, the official communique says that they discussed Brexit, which, of course, Donald Trump was a big supporter of, and the British ambassador, I very much doubt, was, and certainly Cameron wasn't. They talked about defence spending. Maybe actually on this issue, Katie, there is now some degree of alignment because, Trump has made it clear that America will continue with its leadership in NATO, provided members pay the 2% fee.
The thing that is so annoying about this is when Donald Trump says things like pay up, pay up, pay up, talking about maybe the United States is rethinking its policy towards NATO. What he's really doing is grabbing people like David Cameron by the lapels and saying, pay attention, pay your fair share. So Donald Trump is trying to actually strengthen NATO because he wants the other members of NATO to contribute. He's not trying to weaken NATO. He's trying to strengthen it.
Where the difficulties would genuinely have been are over policy towards Ukraine, where, as you know, Cameron is saying to America, come on, keep pumping money into Ukraine, and pro rata, we will pump money into Ukraine as well. I detected strongly at CPAC just a few weeks back when I saw you there, I detected quite a large sense, quite a large American feeling that they're not happy continuing to put money into Ukraine.
Yeah, but I would separate that from they want Russia to take over Ukraine. What President Trump has said is that on day one of the new Trump presidency, he'll do two things: close the border and drill, baby, drill. He is going to make the United States the dominant energy provider in the world. And that's going to, simple supply and demand that drives down the price of oil and natural gas. It bankrupts Russia and it bankrupts Iran. So what's Donald Trump going to do for the rest of day one? He said at CPAC, I'm going to get the Russian president on the phone and I'm going to say to him, unless you go to the negotiating table, I'm going to give Ukraine everything it needs, offensive weapons. And then he said, and then I'm going to call Zelensky and I'm going to tell him, unless you go to the negotiating table, I'm not going to give you any weapons. And so Donald Trump is looking at a way to stop the killing, find a negotiated solution. And then, by the way, and this is what everyone misses when they say, well, that means Trump wants to abandon Ukraine. No, he doesn't. What he wants to do is bankrupt Russia. Wars are expensive. And the combined Western contributions to Ukraine have been probably $100 billion. And that's to buy a stalemate Trump is looking at a very different perspective. He's saying, I'll bankrupt Russia so they can't afford to pay for a war, and then I'm going to force a negotiation, and then the West will invest in Ukraine, rebuild Ukraine, be completely, take Ukraine in all the NATO organizations and the European Union organizations. NATO will be fully integrated. Meanwhile, after the fighting and the killing stops, where's Russia? Bankrupt, broke, nobody's investing in Russia.
Well, you know, the casualty figures from the first couple of years of war are the equivalent to the Battle of the Somme in 1916. About 1 million casualties now between the two sides. It is genuinely horrific what is going on there. But it's so often the case, isn't it, that Trump is willfully misinterpreted on both the American domestic scene and the global scene. That what he wants to achieve, the way he says things, are horribly misquoted. Do you think that David Cameron, whatever his prejudices may have been, do you think David Cameron would have come away from a proper sit-down with Trump actually quite impressed with his foreign policy ideas?
Well, I hope he has, but you know him better than I do, Nigel. What do you think?
Well, I actually think that when you sit and talk to Trump, rather than reading what the New York Times says Trump said, but actually listen to what he says himself, you get a very, very different perspective. And I would like to think that Cameron has been impressed by Trump, and whatever difficulties or differences he may have had, and hey, you know, we've got a Labour government coming in later this year. It's 99% certain. You know, whatever we think about individual politicians, it is in our national interest, both of us, that the UK and America have a close relationship. And I think Trump understands that too, doesn't he?
Yeah, you know, one of our thoughts in the beginning of the Trump administration was if Britain left the European Union, Brexit, which you were the one that managed to pull off, if that had happened, the first thing we would have done is a U.S.-UK trade agreement. The United States does not have trade agreements with the European Union. We don't have a lot of trade agreements. You don't either. But if you had a U.S.-UK trade agreement immediately, we don't have a whole lot of issues between us that we disagree on. But that kind of a trade agreement would have boosted both of our economies overnight. And I think that's still in the back of Donald Trump's head is a UK-US deal. I'm all for it.
Well, we look forward to that if and when he wins the election. Are you feeling confident, KT, that your man's going to win on November the 5th?
I think that the American people are supportive of Trump. What I worry about is the kind of interference in our elections that has happened in the last 2016 and 2020, which is the intelligence community, whether it was with the Russia hoax or whether it was and I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but intelligence officials basically said that Hunter Biden and his laptop and Joe Biden were not having, corrupt activities. So I'm worried that it'll be stolen, not stolen necessarily at the ballot box or computers or voting machines. I'm worried that there'll be election interference of disinformation against Donald Trump. Yeah. The same thing you just talked about, misquoting him, taking him out of context, making him look like somebody he's not.
Yeah. K.T McFarland, as ever, an absolute pleasure to talk to you, whether it's face-to-face or down the line as this evening. Thank you very much indeed.